question that we are always asking ourselves is, how do we engage our culture today? Do we withdraw, as some people advocate for, or do we fight? What do we do with politics? Do we remain faithful or simply faithfully present in it? Or do we seek its transformation? How do we engage our world today? I mean, these are questions that are not new, but the church has wrestled with for centuries, and it's really no different today. We're still looking for a way to engage our world, and each generation, as each Christian group embedded in a culture, has to figure out how to engage it for the glory of God. And that's why I've invited today's guest onto the show, Dr. Stephen Presley, who is the director and associate professor of church history at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's taught courses at several universities and seminaries and continues to teach graduate and postgraduate courses in church history and historical theology, as well as courses in early Christian theology, exegesis, apologetics, and worship. He serves as the Senior Fellow for Religion and Public Life at the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. He's married to Haley, and they have 4 children. Today, we're going to discuss his new book, Cultural Sanctification, that seeks to engage the world like the early church did. Stephen, welcome to Apollos Watered.
Thank you so much, Travis. It's good to be here.
Okay, are you ready for the Fast Five?
I'm ready.
We both have 4 kids. So the first question is, what's the craziest thing about having 4 kids for you?
The craziest thing about having 4 kids is just when you think it can't get crazier, it gets crazier. I have a good friend that says, I'm a conservative, which means I think it can always get worse. And
I like that. I've heard that definition before, but that's really good.
Yeah.
Okay, how about this one? Because you always have 4 kids, how old are your kids?
My oldest is 16, all the way down to 9.
All right. So then we have a very similar problem. The one item that you can't keep in the pantry is what?
The one item we can't keep in the pantry is cereal.
Oh,
Absolutely cereal. And potato chips. They will be my children are like swarming bees. If a box of cereal hits the pantry, or a range of bag of chips, I mean, they evaporate.
what kind of cereal are they into?
Oh man. They love, of course, Fruit Loops. They love, we try to steer them towards the Raisin Bran, but that doesn't get taken, right? that sort of sits there. But the Fruit Loops or the Frosted Mini Wheats.
The sugary ones. That's
the
it.
Sugary ones.
The good ones. The good ones. Okay, number 3, with 4 kids, you got to have a date night sometime. So the best place to go on a date night is where?
The best place to go on a date night for us is just out to any restaurant where we can sit and talk and have adult conversations. Conversations that don't involve, all kinds of teenage drama and drama of middle school and elementary school, and just talk about life.
Our lives are very parallel. I have one in college that's graduating, one in high school that's graduating, one in middle school, and one in elementary. And I fill every one of those.
Oh,
I fill every one of those categories right now. Yep. I realized when I was dropping one of my kids off, I'm like, I've been driving to the school for 18 straight years. This is insane. Anyway.
That's right. I mean, every day they come home, I often ask them about their day, and of course, do the fatherly thing, and it's like, what drama happened today, and try to keep track of trying to keep track of who's doing what and what's saying what. It's a wild time.
Oh, okay. Number 4 then. Let's get into a little bit more of your field. If you were to visit a time of church history, post-apostolic, okay, outside of the Bible, the New Testament, but what time would it be and why?
I spent a career studying Irenaeus. I've spent a lot of time studying the 2nd century. I mean, I would want to be in Lyon in the late 2nd century, definitely after 177, after the persecutions. But I would love to, I've spent so much time looking at those early church fathers. I would, especially the apologetic tradition. I would love to have some conversations with some of them.
Mm.
Uh, maybe some time with Augustine, too. But that second century is fascinating to me. It's a transitional period that I find fascinating.
Well, which we're going to get into in a bit, but let's not get too far into that. How about this one? So we've talked about that, but what about one historical figure? I mean, we already know you like Irenaeus, but who's a different figure outside of the ones you just mentioned that you would love to interview and sit down and have a conversation with, and why?
Uh, I would love to talk to. I would love. I have a lot of questions for Augustine.
Mm.
I've worked through City of God, and I love the second half of the City of God, where he just walks through the history of salvation. And I'd love to sit and ask him a few questions about framing the City of God. If I was going to move to a modern period, it might be Luther. I
Mm.
just find Martin Luther fascinating, some of his writings, and in a Reformation kind of context. But in the early church, I would love to sit with Augustine and pick his brain and ask him some of those questions.
It's funny you mentioned that. I think of different figures from history, and someone once told me, they said, I'd love to hang out with Luther, but not Calvin. Calvin was a genius, but he doesn't seem like he was much fun. Luther had a stein of beer, and it had all the books of the Bible, and he could go from the law and the prophets. And he said his table would have been a very fun conversation.
Yeah, I've been there. I've been to Wittenberg, and I've seen his house and
Oh,
toured his museum there, and the table talks that are there. But yeah, living in Calvin's Geneva might be a little bit more of an interesting
yeah.
interesting endeavor.
Well, even with Augustine, like I remember reading his confessions, and I was like, it was eye-opening for me. I was like, someone who's struggling with the stuff and talking about the stuff that I have to talk about. Like, we're not getting into the nature of Christ. He's dealing with all the sin in his own heart.
Good.
I was like, I get this guy.
I know. I know. The times I've taught confessions and read through it and worked through it, it continues to communicate some of those important truths of just self-examination and recognizing, I need to think about my own house and some things that I need to get in order. And yeah, I mean, I love the opening of confessions and the praise that he gives to God. There's so much there. Yeah.
Mm. Well, we're going to talk about all this historical stuff. Let's jump into the book. So, we're going to talk about your book, Cultural Sanctification. And some people are going to say, what in the world is cultural sanctification? Okay, where are you going with this? I have no idea. We have cultural apologetics, now cultural sanctification. What's going on here? What is cultural sanctification?
As I know, I have wrestled with what term to try to use to capture the missiological endeavors of earliest Christianity. So, of course, the book is really tracking with the first century, the second century, the third century, before the rise of the Emperor Constantine, trying to examine the lives of Christians prior to that. And as I talk about, they're not saints, but they have a posture. They have a missiological, they have an apologetic, they have an evangelistic posture that is one of engagement that I try to capture. And so I talk a lot about virtue in the book, and I talk about living with virtue, but an embeddedness within a culture that is pagan, that is not Christian, trying to live lives of virtue in which they themselves, as a Christian community, and the institutions that they create and interact with are trying to instill and inculcate virtue or sanctification, sanctifying those kinds of communities, the kinds of culture in which they find yourself. So that's the term I settled on, and I describe it in a little more detail in the book. But it is tough, as you know, it's tough to come up with how to capture
Yeah.
some of those things in a phrase.
It is simply because there's so much flying around right now. We're all trying to scramble to find definitions on how to engage and different narratives to draw from, different stories to look to. And what you've done, and by saying engaging the world like the early church, you're not referring to the book of Acts. You're referring to the first 2 centuries, specifically much more the second century than anything else. Why that period of time?
I mean, I begin exactly as you said. I'm focusing on the second century. I mean, given who wrote kind of the history of Rome, the second century is really the height of the Roman Empire. By the time you get to the middle, I mean, Rome is sort of the Pax Romana, the image of Rome that we think of, really comes in the second century. I begin in Acts and I kind of show, let's say, Paul on Mars Hill and, Paul before Felix and Festus, Paul in Rome. You get the gestures in that direction. And then, in like a First Peter 2, live such good lives among the pagans that they see your good deeds. Or First Peter 3, may always be ready to give a defense. Well, what you find in the second century is all of that taking on lives. All of that, like, you meet Polycarp in Smyrna, defending the faith before a Roman proconsul. You meet Justin Martyr writing in Rome apologies to the emperor, defending the faith and explaining the faith. You meet Irenaeus in Lyon writing catechetical manuals to train people to live faithful lives. It's a transitional piece that I just look to some of those impulses and then try to say, okay, can we learn anything? We learn anything today. I think if you look back at the history of the church, that early centuries where they're living surrounded by paganism are a fascinating kind of intellectual dialogue for today.
What I find really fascinating is the fact that you're talking about the Roman Empire at its height, right? And I don't know what this has to do with it, but in pop culture right now, they're talking about men always thinking about the Roman Empire. Have you seen this? All these guys are talking about men think about the Roman Empire every so often. And I even started following a group, and I actually feel as a Christian, I'm like, am I committing sin here by following this Roman Empire thing and thinking about the Roman Empire? And I think it's cool, even though, you know what I mean? It's just some of this stuff comes to mind. But I'm looking at this going, all right, what can we learn from these guys? Because you're right, they're in a cultural moment where, and you see this in the book, it's as if all the advances they had to go back to the beginning, or no, where we're at now, we're going back to the beginning, very similar to the second century, right? What did you mean by that when you say back to the beginning? Because some people are like, I'm not following you right now.
Well, what you just said about the Roman Empire, I remember when I was writing this book, in the middle of it, one of my kids was reading one of the Percy Jackson novels. If you know the thesis of Percy Jackson, basically the gods, the pagan gods take over New York City. And so you're literally, it's like Percy Jackson is like a living illustration of what I'm trying to write, what I'm trying to capture. And that is, the opening scene, I go back to one of the most famous baptistries in Rome, the Lateran Baptistry. And it's actually a trip I took to Rome many years ago. And I stood, this was a place where Christians were baptized, and where I talk about transfer from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. And I just talk about how the baptistry was empty. So I draw this sort of ironic kind of thing in that we are back where we started. Here I am at one of the earliest Christian fonts that was built to signify that many are coming into the church. But now we're back where we started. No one's joining the church. I cite works like Bullivant's Non-Verts and the Great Dechurching and these other things that show we are no longer living in a Christendom, which I define as the institutions are defined by Christian mores. There is now a range, to use Charles Turner, there's now a range of moral options, of which Christianity is just one. And that is reminiscent of that second and third century world.
What I thought was really interesting is you're going through the book, and we have this advantage of looking at it in retrospect, where we know the history and how it developed, but at the time they're trying to figure out their own footing because they're considered really non-entities. They're fringe people. Like, why don't you just get in line with everybody else? Why do you guys have to insist on being different and being distinct? Just stop. And there was all this confusion about them, as you talk about, where they're confused at incest, calling each other brother and sister, or love feast, cannibals because they're drinking on the body and blood of Jesus. and you read this and you're like, I just imagine coming out of church and trying to explain this to your friends, where they're like, okay, just tell us, what is this church thing that you're doing right now. We don't understand. We're concerned for you. Like it's like a Roman intervention in the ancient world. Like, and you're bringing shame to us. Like, me and your mother are really frustrated. I would have been happy if you gone out and gone to tattoos or whatever you wanted to do. But who is this Christus guy that you're following?
Yep.
And they are struggling to find the language to explain to people what they're doing in the world. And you're right. We're back where we started today.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. If you read, for example, I mean, every chapter begins with kind of a story. So I try to use some kind of illustration or story, but one of them, like I mentioned just a second ago, Polycarp's martyrdom, one of the earliest martyrdom accounts we have outside the New Testament, of course, Stephen in the book of Acts. But it's fascinating. In it, you have a Christian who, first of all, the Roman soldiers show up to arrest him. He invites them in. He sets a meal before his enemies, and he asks them, before you arrest me, let me go pray. So he goes in the room and prays, and he prays for so loud and so long that on the way back, the soldiers are convicted because this guy is so pious, and like you say, he shamed them. Then he gets into the amphitheater and the crowd's calling for his death. He's got a Roman official, a proconsul sitting in front of him, and they're like, he's like, just pinch a little incense. And, right there, he quotes Romans 13. He quotes a version of Romans 13. You don't understand, a proconsul. You don't understand, political figure, that my God is king over all. How can I deny my king? You're asking me to deny my king. You're asking me to deny what the apostle proclaimed to me. And you're reading this, and yeah, it's like reading it now in sort of this post-Christian world, things that were refracted for me, things I hadn't quite understood or saw in some of those texts, I see now in some of what's happening within the West in particular, and what's happening with Christians. And yeah, they were not perfect. And I do talk about some of the differences between today and back then, and they were not perfect, but I do love watching sort of organically just how they're trying to engage the world while they are embedded. And it was a fascinating kind of intellectual study, or a study to kind of think about some of these things.
What I really loved as I'm walking through your book, I appreciated the story, especially with Polycarp, Blandina, a figure that I didn't know anything about historically. But you are seeing them. I mean, these are martyrs. These are people that are standing true for the faith in the midst of the public world at which they live. It seems far removed from our audience. They think this is not my world. It is more than you realize, because I think we have compromised a great deal. We like the idea of martyrdom in theory. But when we're faced with the everyday realities, this means you might lose a job. You might be without employment. You might be sued. You could be all over the evening news, or you might be all over bloggers talking about you online, or YouTube videos, people that are, you will be ostracized and canceled. That in some respect, they're dealing with the second century cancel culture that we're dealing with today. I mean, I hate to export terms onto that period of time, but I'm trying to get people to see that this is so applicable to the here and now, where they're at. And this, I think it begs the question, how are we preparing people? And have we as a church, have we forsaken our responsibility of formation for the preservation of institution? And I think Dallas Willard talked about this. When a church removes itself from formation, it becomes the institutional preservation. And you even mentioned in the book later on in the end, when you're talking about, if you come from a seeker church background, which I don't hear that much anymore, but we still have the idea of what it means, where church is about, hey, everybody come here and find your best life kind of idea and find fulfillment. And we're not forming them, we're fooling ourselves.
Yeah. A couple things, like one, for example, in that Blandina account, that's the story I use in the next to last chapter. And I think I mentioned in the book, but as part of that account, they mention multiple people that capitulated, multiple people in the church that pinched incense to Caesar and walked out, multiple people that were under the same pressures. But here's this woman who remains faithful to the end, and the community sort of holds her up as an example. And that's what the purpose of that text is. It's to be an example. It's to say, look, we recognize these things are hard. And here is a posture. And so the church, the very fact that the text is written demonstrates like the struggle that's going on. But that simultaneously, in like the second chapter, I say catechesis and discipleship is cultural engagement. Like we have got to form people. Catechesis is cultural engagement. We often think everything is external, but when you look at the early church, they put such an emphasis on catechesis. I'll give you one example, and I think I only mentioned this sort of in passing in the book, but early church, they draw a distinction between the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 and Paul on Mars Hill in Acts 17. What is the Ethiopian eunuch? He is reading Isaiah 53, and he looks at Philip and says, what do I need to do? Like, what do I need to do? And Philip says, and gives him the gospel. If you go to Paul's like beginning, how many gods are there? Like,
Yeah.
we've got to start at the beginning. I can't just say Jesus has a wonderful plan for your life. I mean, there's like a whole catechesis, a whole discipleship. And actually, Irenaeus, in one of his works, he mentions the challenge Paul has among the Gentiles who weren't already formed. And I see the same thing today. I mean, you can talk about, you can read some of those works, The Great Dechurching, or some of these works. We're quickly moving into a culture in which the very basics of Christian orthodoxy or formation are not even known or assumed. And suddenly, catechesis becomes a gateway into cultural engagement.
Well, let's lay that out, because of course that's what Alan Kreider talks about in his book, the patient ferment of the early church. He talks about those four characteristics: catechesis and worship, and you refer to that so many times. But I think of Keller, before he passed away, creating really the new catechism, and it's this idea of how do we instruct our people. And it's not just for information only. It's formation in order to engage culture so we know how to go about it. It's training. It's a performance script, a bit, if you will. And not only just in information, but how you belong a part of that community. That's one of the aspects that, reading part of the book, the church was not just a means of just coming up, getting Jesus, and leaving. It was a community. And it struck me is the process that they had to go through after they came to Jesus to actually see if they could be a part of the community. Are you willing, are you in an occupation that can be sanctified, that can be shown to glorify God? If you can't, if you're in like prostitution or you're in gladiatorial games, and in my head, I'm going, okay, does cage match count? What about UFC? Is that because you have guys like I remember mentioning these guys are UFC fighters. They're like, I fight for the glory of God, as their tooth is falling out and blood is going down their lip. I'm just like, I don't know if that really these are the things that we're dealing with.
Oh, man.
And there's so many of them.
Yeah. And so one image I use, because I'm trying to capture, I had the hardest time trying to capture what you're describing. I call it a cultural discernment.
Yep. So
we have to you have to look through your life. And so you have this posture of discernment that you're looking through your life, in part because you can't assume that the institutions and the structures are forming you in Christian virtue. So when you embed yourself in society, you're constantly trying to discern. They were constantly trying to discern, does this profession, does this activity, does this, this practice, this festival, do these things promote Christian virtue? And, it wasn't like a one size fits all answer, as I talk about. You had to think through the virtues and vice that are embedded in some of the institutions and professions. And then I also use the language of improvisation. And I know this can kind of be, a lot of people immediately think of like Michael Scott and The Office.
I actually thought of jazz.
Jazz.
Jazz was like, how do I that's what I thought. I didn't think of Michael Scott. Pick him up.
That's what some people mentioned to me. But you're right. And if you look at jazz, for example, the amount of skill and formation that it takes to improv beautifully is a great illustration for what I'm trying to communicate. Catechesis forms you to where you are embedded in a world, and it doesn't matter what you meet. The tradition and the scripture has formed you in virtue to be able to respond to any and every situation that you find yourself in. It doesn't mean you always, you miss a note here and there. But that's what I was trying. That's what the church is trying to do. I do not say they do it perfectly, but that you can see, and yeah, you can see today. I mean, with our kids, with schools, with life, with our professions, just as you said earlier. I mean, you're trying to figure out how to live Christianly in a world that is no longer sympathetic to Christian virtues and Christian values. Yeah.
Well, as the kids and as you mentioned, we are being catechized. I mean, I don't know how many people have talked about this. We are being catechized on our online world, or digitized, depending on what your social media diet is, what your news is. We're all being catechized in one way or another, which means that we're all being shaped to live and be formed in a certain world, a worldview as we go through this. How we catechize our kids is not just giving the information, but it's also giving them skills necessary to discern. I love how you said cultural discernment is discern how to engage. And this makes it very difficult, because I remember growing up, I'm at that vintage where you could get your own TV in your room. And I remember saying, I'm never going to have my kids allow them to have a TV in their room. Well, they don't. They have cell phones, which is worse.
Yeah.
And they're engaging a world all the time, and engaging a world. And no matter how much I try, I can't keep everything out. So I have to teach them discerning skills to inoculate them. Or as one pastor told me, I try to inoculate my kids to the world a little bit at a time. And delve into these subjects and questions and stuff that I think our parents' generation never would talk about with us. We don't have that option.
No.
It's in front of them all the time. You want to talk about sexuality and transgenderism and homosexuality and lesbian relationships and gay, whatever you want to say, our kids, and I don't care if they're in a Christian school. Matter of fact, sometimes it's worse, quite honestly. It just is, because I think to my kids, my daughter would come home and some of her best friends were gay at school, and she wouldn't have those conversations. And so I was constantly, and again, catechizing Deuteronomy 6.
Yep.
This is what you're talking about, except it's not just in the family atmosphere. It's the church, and the church's responsibility to catechize them, right? That's what they were doing.
Yeah, and that's so. In the book, I use like James K. A. Smith's Cultural Liturgies, and I think that's a great book that just talks about how the culture is catechizing you. He uses the image of a shopping mall to argue when you walk in a shopping mall, that everything has been carefully crafted to get you to perform in certain ways. I mean, so there is a performance that is happening, and yeah, you extrapolate that onto our phones, onto social media. Everything is carefully crafted for you to perform, and we have got to come up with alternative performances. And I think this is one way evangelicalism has been weak on liturgy and on worship. We sort of go to worship on Sunday, but realizing the spiritual life is one that lives in these patterns, these like liturgical performances. I talk a bit about prayer and something like, for example, the Didache, one of the earliest Christian manuals we have, tells you to pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. Now, the purpose of that was to create a life where you're thinking about the Lord's Prayer constantly. You're thinking about, this is pray without ceasing. This is a life that is lived, that is formed. So regardless of whatever ditches or dangers you meet, you're walking that narrow path as much as possible with a heart that's oriented toward God, and that's only met through formation. I agree with my kids. My wife and I are very vigilant about things that come into our house, but we recognize it is, they have access to so much, they hear so much, and unless we are forming them, briefly, I mean, we use the New City Catechism. You talked about the New City Catechism. We use the New City Catechism, we do family prayer, we do things that are trying to create a liturgical pattern within our family, but then trying within our church to emphasize a regular habit of going to worship. But I think this kind of thing is what you saw in the early church, and something that has got to translate to today, of a spiritual life that is embedded and oriented towards the good things of God. But it's tough because that has not been the emphasis always within evangelicalism in the 20th century.
That I find is the biggest challenge. It's not just the cultural part, it's the church mechanism itself and how it's been constructed in the last 50 years. Because it has become a part where you get your goods and services and you leave, you're not embedded in that community.
Yeah.
Very few churches, I mean, depending on what your background is, I mean, membership may not mean anything. Like I talked to one church and I said, well, how many members do you have? And they said, well, we have 4,000 members. I said, well, how many do you have on a Sunday morning? They went 1,200. And I'm like, well, you don't have 4,000 members. I don't care what you say. Like you might, but what does membership even mean for you guys? Nothing. It means nothing.
Yeah.
So you have to have a membership at your church that understands a mutual commitment to one another and a mutual building into one another. I think, though, that's a hard thing in this world today because we're fearful. We've been hurt. We know that the motives haven't always been pure. It symbolizes control. And as we're looking at Christian institutions across the board, you actually refer to Christian institutions and the renewal of those institutions because they convey greater meaning. That's kind of the centering on James Davison Hunter's work there, or a ministry like Cardis or Comment that does something very similar. But as Andy Crouch has noted, this isn't just happening to the church where people are leaving the church. It's institutions as a whole that we're seeing. So how do we get and help that when people have become privatized and their idolatry of radical or individual autonomy has gone, in fuego? It's just become on fire.
Yeah.
That they don't want to be a part of the institution because they're fearful of it. How do we help recapture the institutional part in order for the communal identity of catechesis to occur?
This is so hard. I mentioned this at the very beginning about how is the modern world different from the early Christian world, the pre-Constantinian world. And one of the things is I mentioned both. On the one hand, we've had 1,600 years of Christendom in the West, which has been both good and bad. So in some ways, one, we are dealing with many of the abuse, much of the abuse and the sin that has happened at the hands of those who have had ecclesial power and institutions that have not always, Christian institutions that have not always performed in virtuous ways. So one thing, I mentioned this beginning, one thing is we are now living in a world in which we sort of have to acknowledge some of those things. Simultaneously, this is like a Tom Holland dominion, where the church has done some incredible things. And institutions created by the church have done some magnanimous, incredible godly work. So we're often trying to struggle with those. And I mentioned in one chapter on the intellectual life, like trying to deal with current institutions or create institution. And I say it's going to be some kind of both and. I think one challenge we have that I don't really get into in the book is with the loss of some institutions, like say a university or a college or something. There are people who have invested their lives in that, Christians who have now lost that institution, who now have to deal with the fallout and redirect energies. That's a challenge. This is where pastoral work comes in. This is where the good work of helping people grieve the loss of maybe one institution, the recreation of another institution, another educational institution, for example. But that kind of sifting work is going to be challenged. I think at least one way forward is an emphasis on localism. And I do mention this in the book, that one way to overcome sort of what technology is doing is re-emphasizing, as you said, membership and gathering people together on a regular basis. I mean, the last thing is people want to go to another church business meeting, but but creating liturgies and habits of getting people together and
Eating
growing
together.
What?
Hospitality.
Yes.
Just basic things.
Yeah.
It's not that hard. Pass people over to your house to eat, for crying out loud.
Growing together in godliness and, getting off our phones and getting to church together, and pastoral staff that will lead people in hospitality, that will create leaders that are not using, I mean, this is one of the challenge. I can't remember if I mentioned this book. I read a piece, Christian leaders that are using their positions not as platforms, but as servants, as creating environments where people are gathered together and learning hospitality. I mean, I think we need godly leaders, pastors that are kind of leading the charge and creating cultures within our churches and cultures within institutions where servant and hospitality are the orientations, not at the expense of godliness and of Christian orthodoxy and Christian morality, but doing so in ways that are Christ-like and servant-hearted. I mean, I think creating those kinds of cultures in our churches is imperative.
I think it has to go beyond the pragmatic centralization aspect in certain respects, that it has to go back into the home, localization, hospitality. I was chatting with a scientist. He's a NASA physicist, and he was a senior White House fellow. He's an expert in AI. And we got into a conversation on what are the effects of generative AI in the long term. And one of the things he said is, because what we're going to be dealing with in the future is a lack of trust, generative AI is going to create, let's say that you write in your lifetime 30 books, but generative AI says, or people have your name on the title, and says you wrote 100 books. Because generative AI has created other books in your style, just like we see with artists and images, and they look exactly like that and sound like it. And what you're going to find, and I think we're seeing this now, is an erosion of trust and authority in institutions. And we don't trust what we see online anymore. We don't trust what we see in pictures. We trust what we can see in front of us. And that's the locality. I think this is exactly what you're saying. While we are part of a digitalized world in which we can access globalized realities and get messages from people around the world, it has to be embedded where we are with the people that we're in our community. And I mean that. Like, I know that there are those that are fans of online church, and we've had people on the show advocate for that. I'm not a fan. I just don't think that you can. I understand that there sometimes are realities and things that you face that, to me, it's like eating junk food. It hits a craving, but it can't last in the long run. And I know I'm offending some of the people out there because we're doing online conversation, but it still cannot move from the local. And I think even John says this, 2 John, 3 John, I've written to you enough in paper and ink. I long to see you face to face. And he wasn't referring to a Zoom meeting. He was referring to being with people, eating together, supping together, being the body, and taking on that formation aspect, which I think is also very important as we're talking about kids. I think of Christian Smith's Souls in Transition, where he talks about kids that have grown up in faith. How did they stay in the faith? Well, their parents lived it. They suffered for it. They had someone out and another adult outside of the family unit that was backing what the parents were teaching in the home and living out. And that's the community. It comes back to this communal idea of belonging and how to belong in the middle of this world. Now, but not just belonging for community's sake. And this is where I find you talk about in the book chapters, you have 5. Identity is one, citizenship is another, intellectual life, public life, and hope. So you're not just talking about engaging as a privatized, spiritualized community, but you're saying is, how do we then articulate how to live publicly?
Yeah.
Now, why? And there are some people that are still kind of new to this conversation because they do see the privatization aspect where it's just me and Jesus. But as some have alluded to, and we've talked about on this show, your faith might be privately stimulating, but publicly worthless. So what does it mean then to have a theological or a culturally sanctified public life?
First of all, going back to you said something earlier you said about online. I would love to have this conversation in person anytime. We can hang out. I look forward to a time when we could meet up and we could hang out.
Yes.
And I want to connect something you said with the lack of trust, the localism, and then this public life. One of the most fervent sort of apologetic defenses in the early church, I sort of call it, I don't know, I call it a moral apologetic sometime, or an embodied apologetic. But the Christians, let's say like Justin Martyr, some of the apologists, when they were responding to a pagan audience or a political figure or a pagan intellectual, they would appeal to their lives. They would say, look at our lives. In fact, they would say, why don't you just compare the Christian life with the philosophers? Those who are hanging out with the Stoics and the Aristotelians and whoever. Go look at their lives and then go look at the Christian lives and tell me which community promotes human flourishing. I mean, the philosophers may talk a good game. They may have sort of rational inquiry that's intriguing and that's interesting. But when you actually look at their embodied existence, look at the communities they create and the vices that flow from that, look at that, and then come look at the Christian community and see which community you want to be a part of. And so a couple things, like immediately, obviously, the Christians are so embedded in the world that the world can actually see them living godly lives. And the world can actually see what human flourishing looks like because you have families, you have Christians, you have people of faith who have embedded themselves and are demonstrating the beauty of godliness in the world. And that, that was a compelling illustration. And it's convicting for me. I understand the challenge of living godly lives embedded in a world. As we said, I have kids, I understand the challenge of raising kids in this world, but, going back to those early centuries. And I mean, I start out with one story, one chapter of an apologist who's walking on the road, and his buddy, they pass an image of a pagan god, and the pagan worships it right there. And then they launch immediately into a debate. Part of that debate is consider the lives of Christians. And that was one of the motivating factors. And I hope and pray and long for that to be true for us today. I do.
Well, I'm going to bring in something. I worked so I went as an undergraduate to Moody Bible Institute, and we would get jobs because in Chicago at that time, we were nestled between the Gold Coast and Cabrini Green. So you got the ghetto and you got really this opulent world. And we would have, we had to do ministries while we were students. So we would go into all these different areas of Chicago and we would work. And a lot of people wanted to hire Moody students because we were honest. We had a great community, all of these things, right? These young people, we were trying to do what God wanted us to do. Fast forward, I've been in ministry for about 6-7 years, and I meet this guy who's in business, and he's offered me a job. He goes, I'm going against my better. I'm in seminary. I'd already been in ministry. I'd gone back to seminary. And he goes, I'm going against my conviction to hire a Christian. This is a man who is a Christian. And I'm like, wait a minute. What do you mean going against it? This violates what I had grown up with in college. Like, you want to hire Christians. He goes, I don't like to hire Christians. And I'm like, why? He goes, well, they take advantage of me because they know I'm a Christian. And they talk about doing this and witnessing, and they're not doing their work. And they do, and that was the first time I ever heard anything about that, right? Like, wait a minute, that's not how, like, there is a negative here. And I didn't know. And of course, that's not what we want. But I think back to what Russell Moore had said in his book, as he talked about, what's the name of the title of the book? Oh, Losing Our Religion. In the book, where he talks about, we're seeing young evangelicals leave evangelicalism, not because they don't believe what the Bible says is true, because the church itself doesn't believe it. In other words, I'm observing the community firsthand and grown up in it. Now, there are many we know that are, okay? Let's state that out right now. There are some genuine people that love Jesus, that are sacrificing, that are living faithfully godly lives, and they're listening to this show right now. But we know that if we were to have that invitation today, we're not offering a better humanity in many instances, because our churches has become microcosms of a business personality cult that uses the Bible rather than a holistic rehumanization of society, offering a better way to live the way. When you, I mean, do you agree with that? Disagree with that?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, a couple things. Like, I've been training pastors for ministry, well over a dozen years. And that's one thing. You work in seminaries and you see godly people I have so many godly students who are going out into the world, taking churches and doing good work. But one of the challenges, and you can see in the way I structured the chapters, one of the challenges is that it's not just the spiritual life is holistic, and flourishing takes on a holistic vision. In other words, I can't just talk about catechesis. Catechesis isn't the only answer. Catechesis is the baseline, the formation, and then I got to talk about, okay, how do I now view political power? How does now a Christian think about when I venture into the world? I now have to have an understanding of political power based upon a Romans 13, based upon and I mentioned Polycarp, like I said, quotes Romans 13. It's amazing. And then you think about how do I address the prevailing intellectual challenges, that are invading our lives? How do I address that? Then how do I address my public life? Okay, what does human flourishing look like within the Christian community? And then yeah, I end with kind of hope and the way that kind of a thread that ties everything together. But you realize sometimes we've had a vision of the Christian life that is often fragmented. Either the only path forward is sort of political maneuvering, or the only path forward is just care for the poor in this instance, or the only path forward is catechesis. And you realize the challenge lays out is really committing that Christian culture, especially at a local level, where people know each other, trust each other, love each other, are living the Christian life in community. And that, I think, is what has to happen, at least on some level, as we move into what is this postmodern, post-Christian world.
We actually call that missio holistic. That's what we call it. That's our little term for it.
I like it.
We because you have to have the entirety of one's life, drawing on Chris Wright's work, The Mission of God, and the hermeneutic that is, it's all moving to something where it's hinging on the biblical story, drawing on Lessing Newbegin, which you actually do, rooting it in the second century, that they noted that they were a part of a greater story and they played a role in it. And then taking in Kevin Van Hooser's, it's a performance script on the stage of the world to show how we play our part in the midst of a society and how we play it out. But that also is a political theology that's got that in there. It's a public theology. How do we engage? Because the gospel is a political statement. It has to be lived out publicly, not privately. It does have to take in our vocation. You even referenced Joseph Pieper, which we're talking about leisure, which is something that we have not talked about very often within evangelicalism. How does our leisure point to the glory of God? God does allow that. And because we are, as Kelly Kapic has said, we are only human. And we have to live within the limits as being human, because we are trying to show the rehumanization of a society that's seeking to have us to live this certain kind of defragmented, deformed, idolatrous life that Christianity actually gives as a counter formation to all that. Sorry, you're getting me so hyped up right now. I am so hyped up because
these impulses are great, because like if you read, for example, Irenaeus's Demonstration of Apostolic Preaching, one of the earliest catechetical manuals that we have, the whole thing is like the story of salvation. In the mid 20th century, there was something called the biblical theology movement. Biblical theology, Chris Wright, it's kind of evolved and taken on. But in the mid 20th century, there's several that are pointing back to Irenaeus as like the father of biblical theology, because he basically frames the story. Well, that's the thing. He's framing the Christian meta-narrative over and against the other options that are embedded in the culture. So part of the Christian catechesis is saying, look, you're living a different story. We're all embedded in this world. They're living one story that has one telos. The Christian story has a different telos. And you are performing. And so the catechesis was coming to understand. You find the same thing in Augustine's City of God, the second half of the City of God, where Augustine walks through the history of salvation and is saying, look, you people that, he's writing it in light of Rome burning down, because, they're going, well, let's just go back to the pagan gods. And Augustine reminds them of the story of salvation. And that same impulse, I think, is coming back today and needs to come back today. You're living a different story.
Well, it's fascinating you said that, because I just got this one, The Great Story and the Great Commission, and it's Chris Wright's new book that's out, and he's writing on that. But Mike Goheen has written on that, the divine drama of redemption. And I think through we teach this class, or we're getting ready to teach this class called The Story of God. And one of the things that we talk about in it, I said, there's a difference between the Justice League movies. I said, if you've ever seen them, there was one done, it was 2016 or 2017. I said, Zack Snyder filmed the movie, and then his daughter died in post-production. And so he had to pull out, and they brought in, I can't remember it's one of the big directors. They bring him in to Joss Whedon. That's who it was. They bring it in and finish it. So you watch the movie, it's 121 minutes long. but the story doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The cinema, I mean, the characters aren't very developed. You don't understand certain characters. You don't understand where it's going per se, but you get a superhero story. You still get that part of it, right? Well, then what happened is in around 2020, they did an online petition to get, we want the Zack Snyder version, right? So he agreed to do it. He goes back and except this time he makes it into 242 minutes. That's how long it is. And it's got 6 chapters to it. It's in black and white, but it's amazing because now you start to see the fullness of the story that was condensed in the first one that was missed. And I think that's what we got going on in the church today. We've got this idea of, we still get the superhero idea, kind of in that 2 gospel idea, like Jesus came to save us from our sins and offers us eternal life and forgiveness and purpose and things like that. Yeah, that's great. We still get the story. But when you start bringing in the full story of God, you start to understand the prophets. You start to understand, man, your mind is blown because you start seeing your participation in it.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at, like, you find this already in Acts, like Stephen's sermon in Acts 7 is the story of salvation history up to that point. If even I mentioned Paul on Mars Hill, so that he tells kind of a narrative. I've often used Hebrews 11, the story of salvation culminating in Christ. And then if you get into the end of Hebrews 12, it culminates in the coming kingdom of God. He talks about that kingdom that cannot be shaken from Haggai. And like you start to see, oh, the scriptures are portraying this narrative. The early church is seeing themselves living this narrative. And yeah, when you start to see kind of how the salvation is not merely maybe the simplistic form we give it, but it takes on this beautiful totality that is something that's every nation, tribe, and tongue. And there's a beauty of it that is fascinating. I taught in seminary. A couple times I've taught classes called the narrative and thematic structure of the Bible. And I had the same experience with a lot of my students that had grown up in church. You know, God has a wonderful plan for your life. You'd hear these simple gospel presentations. We're all true. But then you step back and you're like, oh man, God is doing something amazing and capturing people that capturing every nation, tribe, and tongue in ways that are incredible.
This is another element. As you bring that up, you use this, what you Andrew Walls, the kind of the father of majority world Christianity, or studying it. He's with Jesus now, passed away in 2017, a pioneer to create this field of really global helping you understand global Christianity. And he talks about how Christianity is then transmitted across, across in some ways faith perspectives, ethnic perspectives, and then how it takes root in a certain individual and culture, which I think becomes extremely important for many of us simply because we've only engaged people, for the most part, are like us.
Yeah.
And the as Craig Bartholomew mentions in a lot of his works, the greatest challenge is not always secularization, although that's one, but even a religion, a world religion like Islam, which we have to learn to address. And as partly in engaging other faiths helps you to see the contours of your own and where the shortfalls in your theological approach or education have been. That they're there. Okay, biblically they're there. The story is there. But how do we help people see in the middle of all of this stuff in which they're trying to engage the need to be able to reach out to someone who is very different from them? They might look like them, may not look like them. I mean, they could be of the same ethnicity, but different socioeconomically. They could be the same socioeconomically, but different ethnically, different worldviews. And today, with the proliferation of our digital life, you can get into whatever subgroup you want to get into. How do we find that common ground and the need to indigenize was the term that you borrowed from Walls. I would like to say the affirmation and the challenge, the antithesis, little triangle, little Kuiper there. What's the bridge in, and what's the way to gospel challenges it? But how do we go about doing that in a world that, number one, is open?
Mm-hmm.
They have a framework, some do, but Yeah, let's start with there. That in a
Well,
world that is at least open, but yet we don't have necessarily a common language to bridge.
yeah, the I use that Wall's his history missiology. And let me back up and say, I'm coming at this from my work in patristics and early church. And you do that work, and what I love is I get into the missiological literature, and I realize so much of the good work happening in that literature is now helping me to make sense of what's happening. So I had to get up to speed. I've read Andrew Walls, I've heard Andrew Walls speak, but when I read that history of missiology, I then compared it. Vince Bantu also wrote a work in which he cites Walls, and he uses the language cultural sanctification, which is one kind of connection or link point with the title of the book. But when I'm describing cultural sanctification, I'm using Walls' categories of simultaneous indigenizing and pilgrim. So he's talking about every time Christianity takes root in a culture, it's oscillating between those things as it takes on the forms and features of the culture. It's indigenizing, drawing on the forms and features of the culture, but then always maintaining a distinction and a uniqueness that is never fully enmeshed in the culture. And that those kinds of things have waxed and waned as Christianity has taken root in a whole variety of cultures. And so that's why Walls was so helpful for me to start to make sense of that, because that's what I was seeing happening in the second and third century. And this gets back to your question, I think gets back to why catechesis is so important, because once you form those first tier things, those first principle things, what is Christian orthodoxy? What is liturgy? That's why I use the language of the rule of faith. These are early creedal confessions. So Matthew 28:19, the Great Commission texts, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. In the book, I talk about how those titles provide you a resume for early Christian confession. Who is the Father? Who is the Son? Who is the Spirit? This is what you confess at baptism. And this is what you confess as you become a member of the people of God and in the family of God. So once we start to get those first principle things, yeah, we start to then take up shop in a culture, and we can start to evaluate and navigate the virtues and the vices of a culture, of the institutions there, as we see the way they either help to proclaim or they latch up with what the gospel proclaims. We use those forms and features to explain the Christian gospel. So that's how I think this is why catechesis and formation is so important, because it forms those first principle things that then when we embed ourselves in the culture, we can have conversations. I think even some of our conversations are about pop culture, or some good illustrations of this, where we can sift the wheat and the tares, and we can start to see. I'll give you an example of the way this happened in the early church. They would often read the philosophers. They would read Platonism. They would read Stoicism, and they would say, look, here are the weaknesses, and this is the telos of the worldview that you have. Let me show you a better path. But that knowing some of that allows that kind of discourse, missiological discourse, to go on. So those are some of the things that I see happening in the early church and today too.
Well, Keller, I think, mentioned that too. He said you earned social capital by being able to explain someone's position to them in a way that they themselves agree with.
Yep.
And then they earn listening. And one of the things that we talk about in our approach that we're hopefully going public with very soon, but we talk about the earned right. And in our culture today, where words are many, you have to really earn the right to be heard. Now, how do you earn the right to be heard? I mean, you can say whatever, but to really make a lasting impact, you have to earn that right. You can't just be a talking head. In many respects, what I see is what I call Christian tabloids. But you have to earn the right. Now, how do you do that? You listen, you serve, you sacrifice, and you suffer. And if you can do that, and that's why we picked Apollos as one of our namesakes, is because here's a guy that gets converted after, I mean, we're assuming, according to Acts 18, because he starts preaching about the baptism of Jesus by John. That's how he's converted in some way. And he starts preaching on that. And then he preaches someplace when Aquila and Priscilla hear him. And they're like, this guy's awesome, but he doesn't know anything. And it pulled him aside to explain the way of God more accurately, and he listened. That's where it's like we want to have that type of posture. We recognize that we don't have we have our own conceptualizations, our own convictions that we believe are true, our own confession. But I love what Tim Keller once said when he put himself in the room in the video series that came out from The Reason for God. He put himself with all these atheists, and someone said, "Could I convince you that Christianity is not true?" If he says yes, all the Christians are going to freak out and they're going to be like, "Wait a minute, how can you do this?" And then if he says no, then they're saying, well, what kind of conversation are we going to be able to have? And then I love what he does. He says, could you intellectually convince me that Christianity is not true? You're a group of very smart people. Yes, you intellectually could, but there's an experiential part of me. And that part's going to have a very hard time being convinced. And I'm like, in my head, I'm going, that's a Jesus answer. That's a Jesus answer. But I think it's very true is that we have to be able to establish a dialogue, a relational dialogue. And that means listening, not just speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the reasons that our culture is having such a very difficult time with Christianity is they do like the benefits. And yes, there are going to be oppositions that are to it because, the world, as Jesus said, the world hated me, it's going to hate you. Okay, we know the world's going to hate us. However, does it hate us for being actually a follower of Christ, or does it hate us because we have taken a posture that is deaf to their actual need?
Yep.
And that's the question, I
Yeah,
think.
I mean, as you were speaking about that experiential piece, it just reminds me of a couple stories in the book. I don't quite bring this out, but this conversation has forced me to think about it in that way, the Keller illustration too. Like, for example, in the Blandina narrative where she's getting martyred, or in the Polycarp narrative where he's getting martyred, at several points in the text points out because of their piety or because of their devotion or because of their resilience or fortitude or commitment, even the Romans become softened and become persuaded. It's like Polycarp was sitting there praying and they're trying to get him back to the amphitheater. And they're like, just, why you're like, you're such a, they're like trying to convince him, because they feel so guilty.
Because you're
Or
such a
Bland,
good guy. You're such a good guy.
you're such a good dude, or Blandina, they say, they say, they couldn't apply any more tortures to her. And they're just amazed at her
Well,
resilience.
go back for a second because most people don't know who Blandina is. They
Yeah,
might be familiar with Polycarp. Tell that story just really quick because it's a very gripping story.
it is. I encourage you to go online. You can download. It's again another early martyrdom account. It's called the Martyrs of Leon and Villa, which were martyrs in around 176, 177 AD in what is modern day Lyon. I've actually been to the amphitheater in Lyon, France, where these martyrdoms took place. And the account is of members of the whole community who are martyred. Multiple people get martyred, including the bishop there. But the story culminates and ends with Blandina. And so she is the last one alive. She's the last one martyred. The text use she is like a noble mother, who is there demonstrating her faith. And, the church was concerned that she might capitulate. Others capitulated. But she is used as an example. Eusebius, the 4th century church father, who writes the first church history, he records this, which is how you can actually read the account in Eusebius's church history in the 4th century. But that takes place in the 2nd century, and it's a staggering story. That's why I end in the last chapter on hope. I use her because the text actually opens with that great Pauline passage: the sufferings of the present moment are not worthy to be compared to the glory that is to come. And then she becomes kind of an example, an illustration, and the community is stirred on to be faithful because she's willing, through Christian fortitude and commitment, to remain faithful to the calling that's on her life. And so there's hope there.
Well, the fact that as it goes on in her torture, she becomes more resolute, but the fact that the church was nervous because they didn't think she was strong enough.
No, they were, yeah. The text says that.
Yeah.
And then, you just see sort of lived out. God uses the weak of the world to shame the wise. And God uses the broken to shame the strong. And God uses those who are suffering to shame the powerful. And it is just the living illustration. The community was concerned, and they say that, and they talk about how much they admire. They really present her in ways that are admirable because of her resolution, kind of drawing that illustration. of the weak things are shaming the wise.
Mm. I don't know. Have you read Scott Sundquist's book, The Hope of History, by any
I
chance?
haven't. I
In
haven't.
it, he talks about, he talks about hope being a uniquely Judeo-Christian concept. And he said, even in the language of Tamil, there was no word for hope
Hmm.
because it was, and again, missiology. This is where, to me, missiology is the key for the church moving forward. And it makes me sick to see so many schools pulling out. Like Biola just closed the Cook School for Intercultural Studies
Hmm.
because there's not enough enrollment, not enough students. And I know that's happening across the board. I mean, CT ran an article in April of 2023 that had 19 Christian schools that had closed since COVID. And I think that total is around 25 now. And it's continuing because, online world, Christian shift, institution, all the above are playing a part within that. However, I still think missiology is the key because it provides the tools of having to communicate cross-culturally in a different cultural milieu or topography. That's where we're finding ourselves. It's, who moved my church? The culture has shifted and it's shifting before our eyes in the last 25 years to make this message known. But one of the things that he mentioned, he said in Tamil, they looked at history cyclical. It was always repeating itself, whereas Christianity and Judeo-Christianity put it in a trajectory to a finished ideal, the consummation. And I don't think we can let go of that. I think we have to grip that because I do think people have an idea and wondering about hope. I mean, Justin Brierley is the surprising resurgence of a belief in God as he's talked about that. I know I was chatting with a woman who had done PhD studies in England. She had been at Cambridge and then at Aberdeen, if I remember right. And she talked about how many professors were coming to saving faith in Jesus at Cambridge. And you're seeing like an intellectual resurgence even within the West, because people are seeing the bankrupt nature of the secularized worldview because it doesn't have any ending. It doesn't have any trajectory. And this is where I think that the second century provides that example for us as we continue to look historically and around the world. We're always mining it to see the cultural circumstances are similar or
Yep.
different. But I mean, I want to go back to something you said in the book. You mentioned intellectual life, and you cite one of the friends of this show, which is Mark Knoll. He's been on here a couple times, as well as David Bevington. And these are my people, my historical peeps, And he says, the thing about an evangelical and intellectual life is there's really not much one. And I know people are like, well, wait a minute. I think, well, that's not what it's talking about. What do we mean by an intellectual life? And how do we cultivate that in the midst of this world?
As I was trying to sift out, when you look at the sort of the panoramic view of all the texts that are being written in the early Christian world, they are engaging the philosophical tradition of the day. They're engaging the modern philosophies. So I mentioned in there, like a great book is Robert Wilkin, Christians as the Romans Saw Them. It's a great book.
I want to read that book.
It mentions it in there. He walks through all the pagans and the scathing critiques of the pagans. I mean, it's funny. Celsus, for example, Celsus, a true word, is one of the earliest that I mention. And in Origen, the church father actually takes Celsus's work on true word many years, 70 years or so after Celsus is dead. It's clear this text has become an important kind of manual for responding to Christians, this sort of intellectual argument. But you read Celsus's on true word, and it's really hilarious because the Christians are like, they're meeting people in the street and they're sharing the gospel. They're creating kind of backyard Bible clubs. These sort of like, they're meeting people, they're engaged, they're embedded in the and the intellectuals, the pagan intellectuals, the rhetoricians, the philosophers and whatnot, are just mocking them and just laughing at them and think they're stupid and think they're ignorant. And Celsus has a great line where he says, the only thing that's true comes through the Greek mind. And so I've said, as I've talked about this book, I said, what the Romans are asking you to do is put all your faith, your hope, your trust in the Greek mind. Like, that's what you're asked to do. You have to place your entire life in the rational inquiry of a Greek mind. Are you ready to do that? Are you ready to think that my entire life now, all my existence is predicated upon the mind of what a philosopher comes up with? And the church is engaging that, and the church is engaging it, as you said, with with hope. And that's why I think that theological virtue threads so much of their interchange. And as I talk about hope, I talk about it eschatologically. Yeah, we're looking forward to that kingdom that is to come, but hope guides how you live now. It gives you confidence and fortitude. And look, I know Christ is going to come again in glory, judge the living and the dead, and establish a kingdom that has no end. That is going to happen. And so it gives someone like Justin in his first apology, he's talking about the kingdom of God, and he's writing to the emperor, and he says, when you hear us mention kingdom, you think that it's like an earthly kingdom, like you think it's like the Roman Empire. You don't understand that we're talking about a spiritual kingdom that is to come, in which Jesus Christ is our king. And so you can already see how the Roman mindset is an eminent frame, to use kind of Charles Taylor's word. It's an eminent focus. It's all about here and now. It's all about building the glory of Rome. The Christians come along and are like, well, we're going to live faithfully, and we trust that just as Christ said in Acts 1, that just as the angel said to the apostles, as you have seen him go, you will see him come again. We believe that, and we live our lives in light of that truth. So come what may, we're going to be faithful and committed to the gospel of Jesus Christ and the proclamation of the good news. And so that kind of intellectual discourse is something that had to go on as they were responding to some of those intellectuals. But that should never be separated from kind of the embedded public life that's the next chapter. Mm-hmm. I don't want to pit those against each other, but see them as complementary approaches. We've got to address the intellectuals, but we've got to address the everyday person that we meet on the streets that are in our jobs. So those things kind of coincide together in the early Christian. I see in early Christian apologetics.
Well, I think you also see that embedded within creation itself, with the idea of vocation, where you're to work for the betterment and flourishing of society. And I know I argued with the president of the school that you teach with about, or teach at. We're talking about what does it mean to flourish as a society in the midst of this world, and how is Christianity essential or helpful in that? Because as I alluded to, and I think I mentioned this in the beginning of the conversation, or our pre-show walkthrough, being in Charlottesville with all these different intellectuals, there were some that were there that just weren't Christians at all. And when I asked them why they were there, they said, because I do believe that Christianity is essential for a liberal democracy in order to function, because it does guarantee a form of religious freedom, and it does guarantee a form of pluralism, in that it enables people to flourish and practice, because it wants people to come to the saving knowledge of Jesus. And again, there's different kinds of pluralism there, and how that works. Now, I know some people might bristle at that, and they'd say, well, there's other governments that don't have any Christianity at all. I understand that, because we're all borrowing from Greek and Rome. But in order to have a moral foundation, you have to be able to call something good and something bad. If not, it becomes an aristocracy, or it becomes a dictatorship or something else, as we get into the aspects of democracy. But still, before you even get into that part of it, because it is good for the flourishing of society, and that's what the early Christian apologists were arguing for, but yet it had to be embedded within the local community, and that identity had to be forged within the local community. And this is what I've found. We've had Mike Goheen on the show, and Mike is taking a lot of Leslie Newbegin as well as some of Kuyper's work, and he's written about the missionary identity and the mission, and developing a missionary ecclesiology and returning to that, rather than a managerial or a kind of a I don't want to say celebrity idea of ecclesiology, that attractive nature, that seeker sensitive idea. But what does a missionary ecclesiology look like? How do we develop that in the midst of this world? And they had that very much in the 2nd century, in a way that I think we would have found to be very startling today. You talk about that in the book, because when people would come to faith in Jesus, they were catechumens. They had to go through a period of evaluation. We don't do that anymore, or very few of us do. What was this period of evaluation before they could ever be baptized and brought into the greater community?
Yeah, this is a good question. It's funny. And we talked about this in the pre-show too, was one of the things that sort of motivated me along these lines is some time I spent among missionaries. when I was actually working, I come at this as an academic. I've spent all my life sort of, at least my early years in the academy. And then I started hanging out with missionaries. I was working with an organization that was sending missionaries overseas to kind of unreached people groups. And I just sat around and looked at the joy on their face, just the sheer joy of the mission that lays before, God's calling upon their life, taking their families with them, discipling their families, preparing them. And I even talk about missiology in the book. And when I talk about it, those are some of the people I have in mind, people I've trained at seminary, people that I've worked with that are going overseas. And I see that kind of joy, that missiological joy that is just stirring. And I love it. But I want to go back to, as leading into that, a really interesting one other book, I mentioned it in the book, by Robert Wilkin, is Liberty of God in All Things. In the early church, you have sort of the first defenses of a religious liberty. So you have Tertullian in his Apology. He's speaking to a Roman audience and he says, why would you want to create irreligion by forcing us to worship against our conscience? And he starts to use that religious liberty language. In other words, Tertullian is appealing to kind of a natural law, or appealing to him saying, do you want hypocrites as citizens? Do you want us to be hypocrites? Do you want us to deny what we believe? Because in order for us to pinch incense to Caesar or worship gods, we have to deny what we believe. So you see this early appeal embedded within Christianity, this motivation and for a religious freedom, a religious liberty, a pluralism, a willingness to work alongside people not like you, but a firm commitment in who you are and in what you believe. And so you can already see it. Tertullian's not the only one. I think a lot of the apologists of the second century are kind of, look, hey, all we want right now is you to allow us to embed ourselves. And we trust that if we embed ourselves, you're going to see the beauty of the gospel in our community. And you're going to see that we, Justin says these things along these lines, the second century apologist, we're your best citizens. We're the good people. Stop killing us, we're the good people here. You get rid of us, you get rid of the most virtuous people that are around. And it's like staggering to read it and think about today. That again, I think, and I have used Mike Gohing's work in class before, especially the story of God or the story of scripture that he wrote. And those kinds of texts, I think the work Mike's done in missiology that I've read is spot on. And it, again, they had to answer the final question, they had a period of catechesis that was longer. One text mentions 3 years before baptism. I would not advocate showing up with your pastor and saying, "Hey, pastor, I got a great idea." 3 years of discipleship before baptism. I say that, I'm supposed to say that to my students in class. Don't voice that. But the point being is this longer season of preparation, of discipleship, of catechesis that demonstrates a membership in the church that comes with both obligations and blessings and a unity that is formed through that. I think those are the impulses we see in early Christianity. I think we see it in missiology. I think it's important for today. Yeah.
Well, there's so much stuff that we can go through, and I do heavily recommend the book. First of all, I want to know, StephenOPresley, what's the O?
The O is Orrin, after my
Orrin.
grandfather, who was a American Baptist pastor in Atlantic City, New Jersey.
Orrin, wow.
Orrin Presley.
It's funny. We've had Alan Noble on, and his first name is O. Alan Noble. It's O. That's the first name. Alan is his middle name. So I'm always like, oh, like I've never had anyone that actually has like the actual name.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, what's O? And he's like, it's Orville. And I'm like, well, thus you have the abbreviation.
Yep.
This is such an important work. And I am going to recommend this to a lot of our audience. I mean, we do read a lot of books on here. I think this is a very important one because I think you're attempting to do what we're also attempting to do. We're all grasping for language. You and I talked about this at the beginning of it. We're all grasping for language to articulate how to proceed in this cultural moment. What's the narrative? What's the story that we hang on, that we go about this? Because it is different. We can't keep doing the way that we have been doing it, because we're seeing people just continue to leave. Now, there's always a purification. There's always an ebb and flow. The church is going to continue in some way, shape, or form. And we're grateful for that, because the message of Jesus is going to go forth. But we're not necessarily, the institutions, as you've already talked about, and the groups that we're with aren't guaranteed to be a part of that necessarily. And drawing on Philip Jenkins' work, The Lost History of Christianity, we know of places that were once bastions of Christian faith. Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. I mean, these were Turkey, bastions. And I mean, they were just citadels of Christian faith that now in some ways are dry wastelands. Even in New England, where we had in America, the Great Awakenings. And yes, there's new movements that are happening. We praise God for that. But they have now such a small amount of evangelicals. And we're actually starting to see this across the Midwest and even into the Bible Belt, where cultural Christianity is still there. And I think that it's been redoubled, if you will, with the Great Migration, people looking for a conservative environment with Judeo-Christian principles. So that's been kind of buttressed too, but that won't last as we go on culturally without another framework or an apologetic in which we are to approach an unbelieving world. Because as it is, and you did talk a little bit about this, we can withdraw for maybe a period of time, trying to follow the Benedictine idea. But overall, for many of us, we can't do that. We have to be engaged. Our world is too interconnected to be able to do so. So while I appreciate Rod Dreyer's book, and Live Not by Lies, and even the Benedict option, I do wonder how viable that is. I know some are trying, and God bless you as you go. But we do still need to be engaged. Daniel couldn't leave. And he's a great example, I think, in this cultural moment. But the question that I have is, we do finish up our conversation here. And I want to have you back, because this is just such a delightful conversation and so many overlaps of what we're trying to accomplish. What is a water bottle that we can give our people to a spiritual truth that they can hold on to and just nourish them this week?
The water bottle I would emphasize is hope. It's how I end the book. And when we think about hope, I mean the theological virtue of hope. And I think that virtue threaded every word that they, or at least tried to thread every word that they say. They lived their lives as if it's true that Christ rules and reigns right now. It may not look like it, but the early church walked in hope, and that hope gave them fortitude and confidence and love, allowed them to, in the midst of the twists and turns and ups and downs and ins and outs and hot spots and cold spots, to remain faithful to Christ when the world was broken. And so I think the theological virtue of hope, that one day Christ will come again in glory, judge the living and the dead, and establish a kingdom that will have no end. And right now, Christ reigns. Christ reigns, and Christ will come again, sustains them. And I pray it can sustain us too.
Amen and amen. People can follow you. They can get the book wherever books are sold. It's produced by Erdman's, and we have the gift as a gift from them to be able to read the book. I would recommend those that get out to see it. And for whoever it was that recommended the book online, our YouTube channel, thank you. We do take your recommendations seriously. When you make comments on our page or this video, we listen to you. And so we want to give you the best to able to help you in your mission, fulfill your mission wherever you are. And I believe this will be able to help in that. Stephen, thank you for being a guest on Apollos Watered.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. What a great conversation.